thing I was always fascinated by was technological forecasting. And I used to be able to keep up with it. I got a magazine that came every month that had all the latest sort of forecasts for technology and all the things. And I used to go to a lot of science fiction movies, and I used to read a lot of science fiction. And that was sort of a fascination of mine. But I found lately that I'm just swamped by the stuff that's happening and how quickly it's happening and the kinds of things that are happening. And so this whole notion that change is accelerating exponentially, that is really becoming true. There were all these forecasts that were made in the past that the whole sort of arc of change was fairly flat for many, many years, thousands of years. And then with the Industrial Revolution and with other kinds of things that were starting to happen, breakthroughs in science in particular, but also in philosophy and other things, that the curve started to get steeper and steeper and until it's almost shooting up vertically right now. Now there's another sort of part of general systems theory that says that can only go on for so long and then it has to flatten out and then we kind of exhaust our resources, we exhaust what's possible. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if there is an end to the exponential growth. You know, I'm constantly seeing in TED Talks, for example, stuff that like the 4D printers. And so the thing to do is not think of it as sort of this novelty toy thing, but think of what the implications might be in the more distant future. Or maybe not even in the distant future, but the immediate future, where things can, through nanotechnology, robotics, and things like that, things can be self-actuated and self-directed and and then through artificial intelligence and through, it's not very good.
No.
Through self-learning systems, heuristic systems, things that are using expert systems to evolve. The whole sort of nightmare scenario in science fiction of the robots becoming much more capable of us and see us then as sort of parasitic beings on this planet, that they're so far superior to us that they don't see any need for us to continue to exist, and then, you know, see Isaac Asimov or other scenarios where they turn on us, and I don't think that's going to happen. Don't have to worry about it. So what I did was, back in, this is back in 2003, I put together this presentation. And you can see this was 2003. I did it for a different course, and I think I showed most of you this last semester or something like this in the technology class. But I just wanted to revisit it a little bit, because what you should be doing as a programmer is programming a building for some future point in time. And the way things go, that future point in time, in a case like this, if it's a school of architecture, that might very well be 10 years down the road when the building is ready to be occupied and people are moving in. And when you think about that exponential growth and change in technology and all kinds of things happening around us, 10 years from now is a very long time. A huge amount of change could occur. If we think back 10 years ago, around the turn of the century, that was a very different time. And this is 10 years ago right here. So the kinds of things I was thinking about 10 years ago to now, the kinds of things that you're thinking about now to 10 years from now are going to be even more radical than the things I was kind of thinking about 10 years ago. So there are some really important questions about how do we know the future, and how should we think about the past, and what's the relationship between the past, the present, and the future? There's a whole philosophy of presentness, which is a branch of philosophy that says there is no such thing as the future or the past, there's only the present. And we can't really operate that way as architects. We have to accept the fact that there is such a thing as the future that we're working towards. We're doing things now to establish a better future. That's our whole reason for being. So how do we prepare for that? And are you learning, as a student here, you've invested 5, 6, 7, 8 years or whatever of money, sweat, sleep, time. How much of it was about developing your ability to deal with future rather than learning about the past or even learning about the present? So much of it is backward looking. And I really wonder about that because this is sort of a pessimistic view of where architecture is heading, that architecture invariably is going to lose the battle with nature. And there is this idea that there's a constant struggle between man and nature, and man-made things and natural things. You see this in ruins. Ruins very quickly are covered in kudzu lines and deteriorate. There was a television series that I really enjoyed that looked at the world, what would happen if man disappeared from the earth, and what would cities look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years, 100 years from now. It was pretty startling how quickly all traces of our existence would have disappeared. Sort of like the Planet of the Apes, where you just see a little bit of the Eiffel Tower remaining. The other thing that gives us pause is how little power we have, actually, as designers. You know, we like to think we control things, that we set the standard and we set sort of what things are going to happen. But we have this tiny little, and I like the fact that it's the tip of the iceberg, it's the top. We got the top spot, but we got a very small chunk. You know, the problems we deal with are not the huge problems usually. The societal sort of world problems are not problems that we're engaged in. We are a little bit. You know, we're now becoming much more concerned about sustainability, and we're becoming much more concerned about poverty in certain places of the world, but we're not really doing much about that. And even the impact that we have as architects on the you know, sustainability and resources, world climate change, and all that other stuff is pretty minor. The automotive industry has a much bigger impact than we do. Although our buildings create a huge amount of greenhouse gases and things like that. But we're really not very instrumental in dealing with the real problems in the world. So in order to be able to cope with all this and be able to sleep at night, we have to figure out some ways of trying to understand what might be the future, and that involves forecasting. And forecasting has usually been some sort of scientific mathematical forecasting, where you predict based upon trends. So what you do is you study the past, and you look for how it's trending, and then you project that trend into the future. And it assumes some sort of a connection between the past and the future, that there's somehow a straight line through the present, from past, present, future, in this whole forecasting is, the premise is that the past will continue into the future, only more so, or with new kinds of things. And it's proven to really be quite an illusion, because any kind of catastrophic event that's unpredicted throws the whole forecasting out the window, all of the forecasting. And invariably, all of the technological forecasting that was done most of it proves to be wrong. We don't have flying cars, as much as we would like, personal flying cars. Although they're starting to emerge a little bit here and there, but it's, everybody was interested in the past, in the 1970s, was really looking forward to having a car in their garage that would fly. And not just because of the Jetsons, but there's also this whole notion of social and political and economic forecasting. Economic forecasting occurs all the time. That's what folks in Washington are trying to do all the time, and on Wall Street. That's what the stock market is all about. Political forecasting, that's proven to be problematic. For example, the Arab Spring was totally caught everybody off guard, and they shouldn't have, but so the forecasting mechanisms were not working. And the internet, and what the internet has done in terms of social interaction, social relationships, the whole social part of our world was not forecast. In fact, at the time when the internet first came out, it was for military purposes, and then when, for example, Facebook, which was really an outgrowth from like MyPage, when MyPage came out, people looked at it and said, well, that's never going to be anything. And it's still around, but it's not much right now. But people just did not expect, did not understand the potential social impact of those kinds of things. And so there's all kinds of new stuff coming out all the time. Like, what's going to be the impact of Google Glasses? What's that going to do? When you can walk down the street and you can look at a building and then you can get all the information about who lives in that building on your phone. It's going to be cool for the breaking and entering crowd. And maybe some other people who want to sell you things. The whole idea of the kind of stuff that happens on the internet, where through artificial intelligence, they are building up your profile of what your preferences are, what you like to buy, what you like to look at on the internet and all that. And suddenly all your pop-ups are geared for you personally. Well, that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg again in terms of how much is changing in our relationship to media, our relationship to how things are presented to us. My daughter-in-law sells those pop-up ads on the internet. And that's a big, huge growing business. Particularly YouTube ads are like this huge new markets are opening up every day because of technology. And I think architecture is really, really having a hard time. It's slowly trying to embrace all these kinds of changes that are occurring because they're occurring so quickly. And we're part of a ponderous kind of enterprise that's more like a tanker moving up the Great Lakes or something. It takes miles for it to slow down and stop. And yet, every time we turn around, there's something that changes things. The new sort of BIM software that comes out every month that's able to do more and more and more. It's very hard to keep up with. So this is from Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan was this guy at the University of Toronto in the 1960s who became a guru about futurism. And his big motto was, or his catchphrase was, the medium is the message. We had never thought about media as important at that point, up to that point. We didn't think about it. We didn't even think about it. We had television, and there would be ads on television for soap and toothpaste and things like that, and that was it. And magazines had ads, but we weren't conscious of media as a thing itself, as anything of any consequence. It was just something that was out there. But he turned around and said, no, we gotta pay attention to the media because that's really the thing that, is the message. It's the thing that is driving everything. And there was things that came out at the time, like Vance Packer's book, The Hidden Persuaders, that talked about how much we are being influenced subliminally by different messages that are being sent to us, that are sort of the subscripts or the underlying messages of all the things that we, all the product placements in movies, all the different kinds of things that we're not even conscious of that are happening to modify our behavior and compel us to do certain things. The problem with this kind of forecasting that we ran into is that there was this big, huge excitement that occurred in the 1950s and the 1960s because of mathematical modeling of population growth. And it's this sort of Malthusian law of population growth that, and they looked at human sort of birth rates and they looked at growth and they projected it into the future, and then they looked at our productivity in terms of agriculture and food supply and water, clean water and all those other things, and they projected that into the future and began to have these doomsday and catastrophic predictions that we would, by the year 2000, be totally wiped out and there wouldn't be anybody around because we would have starved to death and we would have turned into lawlessness and we're still talking about the shortage of water and how fresh water is going to be the next sort of big thing that's going to cause this sort of terrible sort of wars and competition and so on, and the breakdown of society. But it turns out that all these predictions in the 50s and 60s really didn't come true, and these were from MIT and various other very highly regarded, intellectually qualified people who were saying that the world will hit this limit of the carrying capacity. The population is going to grow exponentially. The carrying capacity of the Earth is going to be shrink, and partly because of global warming and other things that we're doing to the Earth. Our ability to support the population is going to decline rapidly, which is going to cause a behavioral sink. In the natural world, a behavioral sink is when a population of animals reaches a point where they can no longer be sustained, disease comes in, there's a rapid die-off, and the population shrinks back down to what's sustainable. And this happens in like herds of deer and caribou and things like that. So they're saying the human population is going to go through the same thing. This was one of our colleagues here at the School of Architecture who taught here for a few years at the beginning of the school, Martin Hawley, and he wrote this book, The Private Future, which seemed totally ridiculous at the time, 1974, saying that we are going to become so involved with devices and media that one day people will be sitting in a restaurant on a date and they'll be on their iPhones across from each other, not talking, texting each other, and that we will no longer interact at a personal level, we will only interact with media. And that it's all about a breakdown in community, and that we, and he called it a hellish world of self-inflicted isolation at the time. And people say, oh, that's ridiculous. That never happened. And so this has been called a paradigm shift, or a sea change, or a zeitgeist And whenever that happens, there's always this sort of in-between period, or the dislocation period like here, where at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, the automobile was coming into sort of fruition. People were talking about cars. And there was this alternative notion that a car should be like a horse, only mechanized, because they were so accustomed to the advantages of horses. And so I'm not going to spend much more time on this. This is just sort of some of the stuff that I have pulled together. Like, I was interested in the pace of invention. And this goes from, you know, the 1950s down to 1980s. And more invention, important invention starts to happen more and more as we go along. And this is on Blackboard, if you want to look at it later. But I think probably the most interesting part is over here, where Arthur C. Clarke, and all of you guys know who that is, right? He said that by the year, and this is back in 1967, so a long time ago, he predicted, and he's been really good about his predictions, saying we would have artificial intelligence, which we have, we would have a global library, which we have, telesensory devices. Now, we do actually have that, but they're not telling us we have it. There's logical languages and robots. We now, and I saw this just the other day, where you can now directly plug into your brain if you're blind, and that causes you to be able to see. And there's a movie that's coming out, or just come out, or maybe it's a television series or something, I don't know, where there's a guy running around who's basically, his head is a brain now. His brain is a computer wired into, you know, I forget what it's called. You guys have probably seen the app. This is the only one. I'm still waiting to see this one. Contact with extraterrestrials. We have robots, we have logical language, we have everything up to there. Memory playback would be wonderful. Machine intelligence exceeds man's intelligence. We already have that too. Intelligence is an interesting problem because it's not just remembering things, it's making connections and being able to do critical thinking. And if you can do artificial critical thinking, then that's pretty powerful. These were some things that were forecast way back in the 60s, like we would end up being able to have facsimiles, which was, you seemed like an impossible thing at the time. And now they don't exist anymore because they're like bygone technology, fax machines, that we could see movies on records, which is sort of this DVD thing that you could bank over the phone. They had never imagined ATM machines. I remember when the first ATM machines came out, I thought it was such a fabulous thing that I actually gave a design problem in the studio to design environments for ATM machines. Cities would die because they don't need to be together anymore because of communication. People could just spread out and still be linked. The whole reason for having cities disappears. And this was really incredible, 1965 flat wall TVs, that one day we would be able to just put a flat screen on a wall and it would be a TV. That wasn't even counting smart TVs. And all of this starts out very often as toys. Toys, in the toy industry, they invent certain things and then they become real. They become fully engaged things. And if you look at the amount of knowledge we have available to us through the internet and so on, it's more than any point in human history. And as this says, the average citizen on a farm in North Dakota, and I've spent time in North Dakota, So this is really significant that someone in godforsaken North Dakota knows more than Aristotle could have known because he has access to all that. And this whole notion of the biology and science and physics and electronics and all that merging together to create humanoids, to create our capability to be physically and mentally enhanced. I just watched Jason Bourne, Bourne Identity last night, and you know he was an enhanced human being. That's not so crazy. You know, we have just amazing artificial limbs now, and all kinds of things that we can do because of bioengineering. And this whole notion of a biosuit, I'm hoping that they come online. They are online, sort of, but come online time for me, because then, you know, get rid of wheelchairs, that stuff. You don't have to worry about living in a house with no stairs and all that other stuff. And then there's all this other stuff. If you trace notions about cities and how we think of future cities, and this was a big breakthrough with cities, garden cities of tomorrow, with this notion about zoning. Zoning hadn't existed up to that point. And Santa Elena's futurist visions for cities of the future that were based upon transportation and movement and intermodal, including helicopters and airplanes and things, which he imagined as being integral to this rapid high-speed rail, similar to the constructivist image. And Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, which was also dependent upon rapid transportation. Everybody lived in this mile-high tower here, and there were these personal, this was a heliport for personal flying cars. Corb, on the other hand, had a much more sinister vision of the future, which is actually much more closer to our reality today than what people have ended up doing, and are still doing. So, you know, this became a model. The Travellists were a group that I spent a lot of time thinking about and working with, because they had this notion about learning from biology to incorporate biology into the form of cities and architecture. And so they looked at the double helix, the DNA, and how the DNA might inform the form of buildings. And this is, again, 1961. And this is all sort of now very current and relevant. And then these are other notions about. This is one that I like to think about, because I knew Dennis Crompton. I went to lunch with him a couple times when he visited the university I was at. And what he was saying is that the physical manifestation of buildings and cities are not nearly as important as the wiring and the way things are connected. All of the infrastructures and all those things are really what makes the place and what makes that are significant. And no one had really thought of it that way before. And so these were some of the notions. This was a crazy idea where next to your mailbox you would have a screen showing what you were looking at in the house, so that if your neighbors were interested in the TV show you were watching, they could knock on your door and say, hey, I'll watch that with you. That's what nobody does for people that, you know, look at porn and things like that. This was a building that was never built, but it was Robert Venturi concept of building a billboard as as active display wall, which was really the first time anybody had made that jump and said, we got this big horizontal surface, let's make it into an active media wall, back in '67. So these are just some other images of future structures and things. So a school of architecture, because architecture is supposed to be forward-thinking, and architecture is supposed to be innovative, and architecture is supposed to lead the way, you really don't want to create a school of architecture that looks like it's from the 20th century. And so the challenge is, how do you program a building so that it isn't associated with a 20th century building, but perhaps a 21st century, first half of the 21st century, maybe. And it isn't just about the technology, it's also about the image and the presentation that gives you in your community. So, that we started slow. That took more time than I planned. But I do want to, for the next 10 minutes or so, talk to people in the groups, particularly the groups going on Friday, and anybody else. And I've got till 12:30 if you guys have that much time. I know that Tim White's class is at 12:30.
Okay.